Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be here and to be with such an interesting audience of people. By way of introduction, I'm a former school teacher, former school leader, former academic, and now I'm taking my kind of academic ideas with colleagues to work with schools to help them create more successful learners. I'm just going to say at the start, there's a book about it. If you want to learn more about that, then feel free to talk to Wendy because she has all the details. So, I wanted to start this session by introducing you to one of my colleagues and good friends, Loyiso Nonga. Loyiso is, he's from Africa, and he has an interesting history. His family were subsistence farmers in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. He went to school under the apartheid system, so under the Bantu education system, which capped some of the things that it was possible for him to do. But he was always really interested in maths. He went to university, to a Bantu university, the Eastern Cape, and he did well. And one of his teachers suggested that he might apply for a scholarship. And he applied for this scholarship and found himself on a plane going to my home city of Oxford. He was the first black Rhodes Scholar in Oxford. Following that, he went back to South Africa, and apartheid was no longer in existence. And he had a good career and became the first black Vice-Chancellor of Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg. He has had, some people might say, a stellar career. But I want us to think about him for a moment, because you might think, well, he's one in a million. He's a quite unique person, and there's not many of them around, and we should just admire him. But he wouldn't say that about himself. He'd say he's a perfectly normal person who had some opportunities, some things went against him, but he was keen and determined, and that's how he won through. So I think the interesting thing for us in education is, what do we take away from that? Do we say we should find, as educators, as teachers, as people running schools, should we be looking for the occasional diamond in the rough, the really exceptional person? Or should we be thinking, actually, more people could be very successful in school and in their adult lives? So that's what I put to you, this question, success. Well, why should I be so interested in people being successful? One reason for that is a personal one. I've researched over the whole of my career into how people who come to be successful think and learn. What is it that they do that makes them able to be successful? But success is important right now, because educational success matters now in a way it's never mattered before. You know this, but if I take a couple of examples, it is the right qualifications in the right subjects from the right institutions is ever more important in people's lives. Most of you are involved in English language teaching. One of the things that you know is that English language acquisition can be one of those things that helps people to have access to becoming more successful. So what we know is if you're educationally successful, you will be wealthier, on average, than other people. You'll be wealthier, you'll be healthier, and you'll make a better contribution to your local society. These two graphs, just showing one from the States and one from the UK, showing the blue bar showing doctoral level qualifications, less likely to be unemployed. No high school qualification, much more likely. Similar pattern in England. But what it means to be educated, as Ben Knight said before coffee, is not just about being able to pass the test. It's more than that. You have to be able to thrive in a complex environment. And our world is becoming increasingly more complex on a day-to-day basis. This is a really nice, interesting slide, I think, from Charles Hardy, who is in charge of education for LinkedIn. And he's talking about, well, what do you need to be a successful learner? And he's suggesting you have to know who you are. You have to know who you are as a person. What is it about you that makes you who you are? It's a very interesting thing in our railway station that I go into in London, which is Paddington Station. Every time you go there, there's a little whiteboard and it has a comment for the day. And one that I read last week read, "Be yourself, everyone else is taken." So what he's saying is, you have to know who you are. So your students, they have to know who they are. It's important to know who you know. Networks are vital. We're more connected than we've ever been. We make use of those networks every single day. If we want to know something or do something, we reach out. I have a colleague who works in biology. He says, there's 6 degrees of separation between species, but he says in education there's only 3. 3 steps to find out what you need to know or the person you need. But you still need knowledge. It is incorrect to suggest that somehow we won't need any knowledge anymore. We just need to know how to find it. It's terribly slow if you only know how to find it. Imagine if you didn't know your tables. Doing maths would be very, very slow. So knowledge is still an important feature in all of this, but it's part of it, but not sufficient on its own. So I've said educational success is really, really important. But the thing that really fascinates me is this. It's our growing understanding of human capability, because what we know from this is far more people could be educationally successful than we've ever thought in the past. So when I went to school, we were ranked in our class, and I was 12th in my class. And I was not a particularly good student. And I used to daydream, and I'd think about how could I get to be 11th? And eventually, I got the answer. Someone would have to leave. Because that's what my school had taught me, was this is your place in life. You're 12th. Be thankful, you could have been 24th. But don't get ideas about being anything better. Now, what we now know is, actually, they were wrong. That was our thinking at that time. But our thinking now is that we can develop people's capabilities. And, I feel I've got some kind of I'm in some kind of in a position to say something about this, having researched it over a long period of time and being part of a community of researchers on a global level looking into this whole question. But the short answer is, what we used to think was only possible for a few is now possible for the vast majority. Think about that for a minute. What we thought was only possible for the few is possible for the vast majority. The old bell curve, wrong. How do we know this? Well, we know it from psychology. So all of these people in their different kinds of ways are researchers who have contributed to our knowledge around all of this, which suggests that we can grow people's ability, their intelligence. It's not set. Carol Dweck's work, which was mentioned before, on growth mindset, is probably, certainly in some countries, amongst the most well-known. The idea that in a fixed mindset, that's what my school thought, you've got a set level of ability and that will dictate how well you'll do. You might do a bit better if you go to a good school, but overall, it will dictate how well you'll do. In a flexible mindset, what you're saying is, that's just the starting point. Nurture can make a huge difference. But if we had a kind of continuum here between, on that side of the stage, the researchers who think that it's all in the genes, so however Whatever you were born with, that will dictate how well you will do. And at the other end, no inherited characteristics make a difference. Anders Ericsson, Florida State, would be right over that side. And he's done massive studies where he's taken random samples of people and he's trained them to become successful in whatever domain he chooses. He is the person who first came up with this idea of deliberate practice, and a particular phrase that some of you may have come across because it's quite famous now: it takes 10,000 hours to make an expert. He always points out, however, just because you've done 10,000 hours doesn't make you an expert. You have to do the right things. But nonetheless, what he's saying is you can learn. We can learn how to be good. And we do not have the kind of constraints that we had before. Other people who are also thinking in that field, Robert Plomin, he does work on twins separated at birth, looking at the environmental factors that make the difference. Oliver Jones, he's a UK journalist, very much in this space, talking about how we can grow our intelligence. And finally, Benjamin Bloom. Put your hand up if you've heard of Bloom's taxonomy. It's a worldwide phenomenon. He developed that in 1956. Things have moved on. It's still valid, but there's a lot more sophisticated thinking about hierarchies of learning than that right now. And even Benjamin Bloom himself has done much work since that point. And in 1968, he came up with this concept called mastery. Put your hand up if you've heard of mastery. It's been a bit of a slow burn, mastery, but it's really taking off now. And the idea of mastery being that instead of thinking about people having certain levels of ability and therefore performing at that level of ability, what we need to think about is, what do we want someone to master? And then they keep going till they master it. Because in the end, most of us can master most things. So instead of thinking about, I'm teaching my lesson and a certain percentage of people will do it well and some people will not do it so well, what you're thinking about is everyone's going to master it. Some will take longer. It'll be a bit more of a journey, but everybody's going to get there. I sometimes think it's useful to think about the driving test. Did you take a driving test? Even if you failed it the first time, or even the second, or even the third, everybody gets to pass it eventually. And not only that, the best drivers were not necessarily the ones who got there first. So think about that in learning terms. We tend to think the people who get there first are the best. They're not, necessarily. Getting there is what we need to focus on. So, don't blame it on the genes. The fact that I was 12th in school does not mean that I'm going to be 12th all my life. I can be somebody completely different. And whatever age you're teaching at any given time, what you're seeing is a snapshot in time about that student. It tells you something about where they've come from. It tells you pretty much not a lot about where they could go to. It's not about measuring a certain amount of potential and then deciding you will therefore, this is your potential, therefore you'll go to there, or this is your potential, therefore you'll go to there. It's about saying, this is where you are right now. We want you to be over there. How are we going to get you there? So psychology, over the past 30 years, this has been the prevailing wind. This is what people now think generally. There are a few people who still think the genes are very important. There are some people who think, like Anders Ericsson, they're not in the least bit important, but most people are towards that end of the stage. They're beyond the middle. And why does it make more sense to us now? Well, this is the answer, is the new kid on the block is neuroscience. And neuroscience is showing us precisely what happens in your brain when you develop. So it shows that you can create new neural pathways. Of course, what that means is, even if you're not good at something now, you could probably become good later. We used to think in the past that, this was all inherited in families. I'm going to just tell you a little story about a bit of my family, where the father is a physicist and the mum is a mathematician. So it's a very particular family. And when in their family, they had a young daughter who's one of my relatives, aged, she was about 4 at the time, and I went round for tea with them. And she answered the door, and she was terribly, terribly excited. And she said, "We are going to have cake." And they did not eat a lot of cake in their family. They were very healthy. They didn't often have cake, so it was a big occasion. And she said, "I'm going to cut it." So I said, "Well, that's fine." And we approached the cake, and she lifts up the knife, and she looked at me, and she said, "How many degrees would you like?" Of course, when she goes to school, people think she's a maths genius. But she's not actually. It's just that maths is talked about a lot in her family. Pretty unusual family. But is she any good at art? Who knows? She's never had the chance to find out. And that's the thing, part of what we know is you need the opportunity to experience things to know whether you're going to be good. So even natural aptitude. But if you work at something for a long time, your brain actually changes its formation. In England, there's been a big study done on that with taxi drivers who have to, in London, they have to do, some of you may know this, they have to do a particular examination. They have to do an exam called the knowledge, which means they have to know 24 routes in London, which are very complicated. And it takes them a long time to learn them, usually about between a year and 2 years. And that's why they're so good. But what has been found is when you put those taxi drivers' brains into an MRI scanner, they look slightly different from the rest of us because they have developed a particular set of knowledge and skills. So, the fact is, we could get there. Think about that for a minute. In theory, every child could be educationally successful. It's not happening right now, that's for sure. But in theory, it could happen. So what I'm interested in is how do we kind of get into the space where we expect more and we build it? Because it isn't going to happen by chance, and it's not going to happen by doing the same old as we've always done. So I have this approach to this, which I call high-performance learning, which is a kind of practical way of trying to make this happen. And it says, I think we should normalize high performance. We should say, high performance is what we expect in this school, in this class, in this course. Everybody's going to do well. Everybody's going to pass their driving test, or whatever it is. And then we need to work backwards from that. Well, how do we make that happen? But a good place to start is to say, if we were thinking about what kind of people are we trying to produce, I do think this is an important thing to think about because that's at the core of it. So in my view, we definitely need these high performers who will do really well, on the tests. I think having the test still counts. We have a big discussion goes on in England about why some of our leading professions like lawyers, why they only choose students from certain universities. Then the answer they give is, it's too complicated to look at everybody. So we use a kind of proxy. What we say is, if you've got to that university, you must be good. Somebody else has made that decision on our behalf. So it's easier, we just decide those are people we're going to look at. It's not a very equitable way of thinking about it, and I'm not recommending it. But I am saying to you that in any world, qualifications count. So we can't pretend, not having the results would still be okay. But we want more, so it's grades plus. And what's the plus? Well, I think some of it's about those life skills. It's about those things which enable us to think as a responsible person who cares about other people, who wants to make a difference, wants to make a better world. And then the final piece is about enterprising learners, people who can figure things out for themselves. So if you, in your environment, in your classes, in your courses, in your institutions, if you spoon feed people all the time, they will never learn how to solve problems for themselves. You have to give them lots of opportunities to solve those problems. It starts early. When your 2-year-old can't put their coat on, some parents just do it for them. Others let them struggle a bit. Struggle's good. Solve it for yourself. Learn that you can master things. You can conquer them. And I would say that this has become a really, really, really important part of being a success now. That when you talk to people in adult life who have been very successful, and it does not matter in which domain, and there's a lot of research on this from colleagues, fellow researchers, doesn't matter whether we're talking about Nobel Prize winners and field medal winners in maths, or whether we're talking about Olympic swimmers or musicians. You have to figure things out for yourself. And that's one of the skills you need to, the competencies you need to develop in your students. So the second sort of lesson from this is it doesn't just happen by chance, you've got to plan for it. So if I want every student in my class to be successful, I've got to have a carefully and meticulously structured process for making that happen. This is all about individuals. It's about flexing to help everyone get over the hurdle. Fortunately, we know a lot about how people get to be successful, and it's really straightforward. So potential is a factor. We used to think that was the determining factor. Now we don't. Now we just think we can build your potential to be successful. You have to hit the right opportunities, and you have to get the right support at the crucial moments. When you're about to give up, somebody helping you to stick with the program is fundamentally important. Anybody who has tutored any long program knows that that is the case, and it doesn't matter whether you're 2 or 22 or even 52. It's still the case. You need support at the crucial moments. But ultimately, you have to want it. You have to be motivated to want it. And usually people, when they're thinking about, do I want it? Am I motivated? There are things which make it important to them. So is your course relevant and important to them? And have you explained to them why? Because if you haven't, how are they supposed to know? It's really crucial that people understand why they're doing what they're doing if you want them to be motivated. But even if you have explained it to them, it is the case that people come in different personality types. So some are an easier win than others. On the top right, the dolphins are out there with you, swimming ahead. They want to do it. They're up for anything. They're volunteering themselves. They're keen. They're enthusiastic. You want everybody to be like that. The puppies, well, they would be like that, but they're just not quite confident enough. So they'd like to be a dolphin. You've got to help them become a dolphin. You've got to build their self-confidence, their self-belief. You've got to tell them they can do it. Yes, of course you can do it. Yes, why don't you try that harder one? I was watching a primary school, an elementary school in Doha recently. They had something called Chili Challenge, where when they gave their tasks to their children, they said you can choose a mild chili task or a medium chili, or you can go for the hot chili challenge. Of course, lots of their children start cautiously because they're little puppies, but eventually they're going for that hot chili challenge. They want it. So finding techniques to motivate are important. The bears, they're fierce. I can do it. I don't need your help. Yes, I know how to do it, but they don't really. And you have to kind of somehow get alongside them and sort of suggest that you could be some assistance, but they don't reach out to you much. They're kind of tricky. And then finally, there is the sloth. Anyone who has been a teacher recognizes the sloth. They would do it, but there are so many things that have stopped it from happening. Well, I would have done it, but I tried to do it, but. It's all about trying to recognize that different people have different forms of motivation and thinking about the techniques that can help to motivate people more. Lots of work out there that does that. So on my little formula, the thing is, you've got to optimize all of those things. It's no good pressing down hard on one, say motivation. Motivation's really important, but it's not enough in itself. If you don't create the opportunities and provide the support, it won't happen. Ben Knight before coffee mentioned grit. Grit, perseverance, really important, but it won't deliver on its own. There is no silver bullet in learning. It's a complex set of things, and you have to develop all of them. So what does that look like then? Well, assuming that we can grow potential, assuming that we can get our students motivated, we want to concentrate on the opportunities and the support piece, because that's crucial. The work that I've done around all of this derives from how the most successful learners in childhood and adult think and learn. And what we know is that there's actually two parts to this. It's how they think cognitively, and it's how they behave as a learner. So whatever you call this, those are the two pieces that matter. And they're like the double helix. One's no good without the other. And sometimes we focus strongly on building ways of thinking, and sometimes we focus strongly on building learner behaviors. But it's no good just focusing on one or the other. You've got to focus on them both, because they are inextricably linked. So if I thought about the thinking then, we've done a lot of work on this, and it fits quite well with what Ben was saying before coffee about his framework. Except we were coming from a different place, because coming from what do we know about how the most successful people succeed, and how can we unpick that and then build it up so we can replicate it with more people. But very similar in its patterning, and you'll see this, and I won't dwell on it too much because Ben has just talked to you about it in a similar but different kind of way. So we find from the research and from my fellow researchers, and I did a piece of work where I was commissioned to look at 30 years of research in this area and synthesize it. And there's a lot of commonality about what people think. These things come out as fundamentally really important. Creativity, being creative, thinking about your thinking, meta-thinking, linking one idea with another, analyzing logically and critically, and realizing. Realizing is how it comes to life. So automaticity, not an easy word, is an American word, but it means getting things into a state where they're so automatic that you don't have to think about it. It's really important, because the more you can put into that I don't have to think about it space, the more it frees up brain space to think about the more advanced and important things. So these things are the ways of thinking that we think are important, in which we work with schools in the UK and throughout the world on how can we bring those to life in classrooms, in curriculum, in learning materials, in the pedagogy of how the teacher teaches, to make them happen in practice. Some things, like big picture thinking, what does that mean? It means you start with the big concept rather than we are going to do this tiny little thing. Because sometimes if you talk about the big concept, why have we got global warming? That's more motivating for people than beginning with the small piece. What are the behaviors? These are a bit more familiar, but we've drilled them down to being empathetic, agile, and hardworking. And like Ben said, we have put them into progression. I'm just looking at open-mindedness here. But one thing I'd say is I don't think these are at all age-related. I don't think you can say that this is what you do at primary or this is what you do at secondary. If I take a concept like empathy, I have met some very young children who are good on empathy. I had a conversation with one young girl recently, 7-year-old. She never puts her hand up in class. And her teacher was quite worried about it because she knows the answers. So she said, why don't you ask her why she doesn't? So I did. And her answer to me was as follows: I don't put my hand up in class because I often know the answer, but the teacher doesn't want the same person to give the answer every time, because it makes it difficult for her. So what I do is I wait to see if anyone else puts their hand up, and then if no one else puts their hand up, then sometimes I put mine up, because it's also difficult for the teacher if no one gives an answer. Now, I have worked with adults who have not yet reached that degree of sophistication, and so have you. So, in many ways, I would suggest that whilst you can plot out a progression in empathy, or in any of these, they're not age-related, and for us to be high-functioning individuals, we want to try and get ourselves as far up the track on as many of them as possible. And for some students, actually mapping this for individual students is a very, very interesting exercise, because some students who are conventionally your high performers may not be so good on all of these elements. Equally, some who you might think of as not being particularly strong, some of your weaker students, are actually quite good on some of these things. So it's about recognizing that there's a broader profile in the 21st century that's required. And for some people, they might be quite confident, and it might be a bit of a shock to learn that they're not managing all of them. But for other people who thought they weren't doing so well, they can actually feel quite positive about the fact that they are doing well on some of these things, and these things are important. We call them the values, attitudes, and attributes, and the advanced cognitive performance characteristics. Bit of a mouthful, so we usually call them the VAAs and the ACPs. But they are the building blocks, they're the foundations of everything else. And there are things that you can do in school or in your course or in your institution that are helpful in bringing these into play. You have to think everybody could get there, because if you don't believe it, it isn't going to happen. And believe me, I have conversations with sets of teachers, and they tell me, yes, I believe this, and then I say, talk to me about your class. Talk to me about the student who is the lowest performing student in your class. Are you sure that you believe that he or she could get there? Oh, and not him. Well, then you're not believing it. You're believing it on an intellectual level, but it's not changing your practice. And if it doesn't change your practice, it's no good. So, inquiry-based approaches help you get into some of the territory about advanced cognitive performance. I am not saying that standing at the front and lecturing or teaching from the front is wrong. I'm just saying that if you ask something as a question, you problematize it, and that's helpful. Expertise development is the idea that you're becoming expert in your subject. English language teaching. What does it mean to acquire expertise in English as an additional language? Interesting thing to think about. What would it look like? What would a good one look like? Not, can they pass the test? What would a really good one look like? What would they be able to do? Practice and training, vital. Feedback, absolutely crucial. That's how we get better. But bad feedback's worse than no feedback at all. Feedback important, bad feedback damaging. Think about it. The odd off-the-cuff comment can empower somebody and turbocharge them, or it can stop them doing something for life. Worth thinking about. Engagement of, if you're working with younger people, engagement of their parents, getting them on board can help a lot. But most crucially of all, this is about doing things with students, not to them. It's their learning journey. If we are saying everybody could potentially be successful, we need to think about what are the barriers that are stopping certain individuals from getting to where we want them to go. And how can we take down those barriers? And they look different for different individuals. And those individuals need to understand those barriers themselves and start to work with you on how to remove them. Otherwise, it isn't going to happen. Then we get the kind of students we're talking about. Just want to finish by saying a couple of things about the sort of thing I've been talking about. The first is this. Some of the things in this are definitely hard to measure. We've been looking at measuring this, and we're looking at some software that enables schools to do this in relation to individual students. But just because they're hard to measure doesn't mean they're not important. They are fundamental to being successful. Now, when I'm talking about success, I'm not even just restricting it to life skills. I'm also saying if you want to be cognitively successful, you need all this stuff. So I don't think there's academic over here and life skills over there. I think it's all the same thing. If you're going to be successful in anything you do, you need this broader set of capability. The second is you can't operationalize this on somebody else's behalf. So if you are responsible for other teachers, other professionals, you've got to galvanize them to be able to do it. You can't help them to do it with just giving them a set of instructions. You cannot mandate this. In this nice diagram about how professionals work, or anybody in the workplace, you want them down there in that bottom right corner. They're deeply committed to this, and they're going to figure out what's stopping that student from getting where they want them to go. They're going to work at it and figure it out. They're going to do it because they believe in it, not because you've told them to do it and there will be penalties if they don't achieve it. They need to believe it. They want to do it. And then finally, it does speak to the issues, as Ben said before coffee, that are really prominent in our world now. This is the OECD assessment framework coming out, assessing a broader range of skills and competencies. The great Andreas Schleider, who is in charge of the PISA tables and all other things, the educational league tables. Even he is saying we need to move from some students learn at high levels to all students learn at high levels. And I like this. This comes from a head teacher in London, in England, who says, you know, we're not going to live in a very happy world unless we, as educators, are addressing these items around how we live comfortably alongside people globally, and we take responsibility for that. And being against expertise, that's a bad thing. We want everyone to feel they can be an expert. So, this is where I leave you. At the end of your conference, you have had a magnificent few days thinking about all of the issues around better learning. I'm finishing your conference by saying everyone could be a success, but only if you make it happen. Are you up for the quest? Thank you.